The silver blade touched my throat, before my groom even rejected me. I stood in my white wedding dress, while a thin line of blood slipped down my collarbone, staining lace my mother had sewn with her own hands. The whole pack watched in silence as Lawrence turned away from me and lifted the mating veil over my sister's face. Nicole smiled beneath it. Her hands, I noticed even then, would not stop trembling. "Brenda is unworthy," Lawrence said. "I choose Nicole." The hall erupted. Some laughed. Some looked away. My father lowered his eyes like I had already died. Then the elders opened the black iron doors. Chains scraped across marble. A man stepped into the wedding hall, with a cane in one hand and broken silver cuffs around his wrists. His eyes were covered in dark cloth. Every candle in the hall trembled as he walked. Edward, the blind alpha, the curse they kept alive just to frighten children. An elder leaned close and whispered, "Marry him, girl. At least your shame will serve the pack." I lifted my bleeding chin. "Bring me the chained wolf." Every candle in the hall burned blue, and somewhere beneath my ribs, something old and unnamed answered back. 3 hours before that blade touched my skin, I had believed I was the luckiest woman in the Ashvale pack. I want to tell you what it feels like to plan a wedding you think will save your family, and then watch that same wedding become the moment your family destroys you. But this isn't only a story about rejection. It's a story about a kind of power the pack feared enough to bury alive, twice. Once in a woman named Sarana, 12 years ago, and once, apparently, in me. This is a story about what happens when the thing everyone tries to contain finally stops holding still. If you've ever been told your strength was too dangerous to be trusted, stay with me. This story was written for you. Follow along, because what wakes on the blood moon doesn't just crown a queen. It costs one. 6 months earlier, I had been called blessed. My father, Martin, was a mid-ranking elder in the Ashvale pack, respected but never powerful enough to sit at the head table during the moon councils. When Lawrence, heir to the Ashvale Alpha line, chose me at 17 as his intended mate, my father wept with relief. Not joy. Relief. As if a debt had finally been paid. Lawrence had made me one promise in those 6 months that I held onto tighter than any other. We were standing on the training bluff above the valley, watching the younger pups spar below, when he took my hand and said, "Whatever happens between us, Brenda, I will never let this pack humiliate you. I'd rather lose my rank than watch you stand alone in front of them." I believed him completely. I had no reason not to. The wedding hall of Ashvale was carved from black stone, older than the pack itself, its pillars etched with the names of every Luna who had stood beneath that roof, save one, whose name had been quietly chiseled away, leaving only a smooth, deliberate scar in the stone. I noticed it that night, and thought nothing of it. I would think of little else within the week. I stood in white, my heart a drum against my ribs, and I watched Lawrence walk toward me across candlelight. He didn't stop at me. He stopped one step past me, in front of Nicole. The silence before he spoke was the loudest sound I have ever heard. "Brenda is unworthy," he said. His voice didn't shake. He had rehearsed this. "I choose Nicole." For one full second, I wasn't in the hall at all. The floor seemed to tilt beneath the soles of my shoes, sound thinning into a high, distant ring. My own name repeating somewhere behind my ears, the way it does right before you faint. My hand found the edge of the altar rail before I'd told it to, gripping hard enough that the stone bit into my palm. I thought, absurdly, of the training bluff, of his hand in mine, of a promise made in daylight that apparently only counted until something better came along. I thought, I am going to be sick in front of 300 wolves. I was not. But for that 1 second, I came closer to collapsing than I have ever admitted to anyone, including Edward. Then the ring in my ears faded, and something colder and steadier took its place. I want to tell you I screamed, or fought, or fell. I didn't. Not because I was strong, but because some old, stubborn part of me refused to hand this family one more thing to spend. I had spent my whole life being the quiet installment on a debt I never agreed to. I was not going to let my own wedding be the final payment. I fixed my eyes on that scarred, nameless patch of stone above the altar and forced my spine straight, one vertebra at a time, the way you rebuild something after it's already cracked. I looked at Nicole, radiant beneath my mother's veil, and something in her didn't match her smile. Her hands, clasped in front of her, would not stay still. When the officiant reached to settle the veil's hem against her collarbone, she flinched from the fabric like it had burned her. A small motion, gone in an instant. One I would have missed entirely if I hadn't spent a lifetime learning to read, every tell my sister's face had ever given away. I didn't understand it yet. I only knew that a woman who has truly won does not flinch from her own prize. An elder, Roland, sharp-jawed, cold-eyed, a man who had never once looked directly at me in my life, stepped forward with a ceremonial blade. Rejection in Ashvale was not just spoken. It was marked. The blade kissed my collarbone, a shallow cut meant to prove that a discarded bride carried no claim, no bond, no protection. Blood slid down my skin. My mother did not move to help me. My father stared at the floor. That was the moment I understood. This had never been a wedding. It had been a transaction, and I was the price someone else was finally ready to stop paying. Then the black iron doors at the far end of the hall groaned open, and the pack's whispering died into something closer to fear. Chains, a cane striking stone with each measured step. A man with cloth bound over his eyes and scars threading down one side of his face like old lightning. He walked, as if the darkness didn't frighten him at all. As if he had made peace with it years ago, and simply hadn't told anyone. Edward. I had heard his name my whole life, the way children hear the names of monsters. The blind alpha. Cursed the night his mother died. Locked beneath the western tower for 12 years, brought out only for punishments, warnings, and now, apparently, humiliations. Roland leaned toward me, his breath cold against my ear. Marry him, girl. At least your shame will serve the pack. I looked at Lawrence, who could not meet my eyes. I looked at Nicole, still trembling beneath her stolen veil. Something in me, grief, maybe, or the last scrap of pride I had left, turned to iron. Bring me the chained wolf. The candles along the walls flared blue, all at once, and stayed that way. Nobody in that hall had ever seen fire do that. I hadn't either, and beneath my ribs, for one disorienting heartbeat, I felt something answer the flame. Not warmth, exactly, but a pressure, like a held breath finally noticed. They married us within the hour, before I could think better of it, before Lawrence or my father could change their minds about how far my punishment should go. Afterward, guards led Edward, still chained, with me walking silently beside him, down a narrow stone corridor to the western tower. The cell smelled of old smoke and colder stone, of iron gone slightly rusted from years of damp. There was a single narrow window cut high in the wall, too small for anything but moonlight to pass through. You didn't have to choose me, Edward said, once the guards were gone, and the lock had turned. His voice was low, rough from disuse, but not unkind. You could have let them send you back to your father's house in disgrace. Instead, you chose the one thing in this pack everyone is taught to fear. I'm done being the quiet part of someone else's ledger, I said. It wasn't a clever line. It wasn't meant to be. It was simply the truest sentence I had left in me. For a long moment he was quiet. Then unexpectedly, he laughed. A short, surprised sound, like he hadn't laughed in years, and had forgotten how it felt in his chest. That's the first honest thing anyone has said to me since they took my eyes. I sat across from him, closer to the fire, still bleeding faintly at the collarbone. Edward's head tilted, nostrils flaring slightly, and his expression shifted toward the door, toward the direction we'd come from. "Your sister's veil," he said slowly. "It smells wrong." "Wrong how?" "Old blood, not fresh. Years old, sealed into the thread itself." He paused, and something guarded moved behind his stillness. Someone stitched a dead Luna's blood into that veil a long time ago. I think it's a warning. I don't yet know what it's warning against. "You can smell that," I said, "through cloth, through a room full of perfume and candle smoke." "I can smell lies, too," Edward said. Lawrence's heartbeat changed every time the words Moon Throne were spoken tonight. "The Moon Throne has been empty since before I was born," I said. "There is no royal line left in Ashvale. The last Luna died the year you were blinded." Edward's jaw tightened. "That Luna," he said quietly, "was my mother." The fire cracked between us, and neither of us spoke for a while. "Is that all you know?" I asked carefully. "Or is there more you're choosing not to tell me?" He didn't answer right away, and that silence told me more than any answer could have. "There's a difference," he finally said, "between what I know and what I'm afraid of. Tonight, I'd rather give you the first and spare you the second, until I'm certain the second is even true. I'm not protecting a secret from you, Brenda. I'm protecting you from a fear I haven't earned the right to hand you yet." His voice roughened slightly on that last part, and I understood, without him saying so, that his composure cost him something every time he chose it, over honesty. I didn't press him further. I would come to regret that mercy later, not because he lied to me, but because his silence, however well-intentioned, nearly cost me everything he was trying to protect. I didn't sleep that night. Near dawn, Edward told me what he did know, piece by piece. His mother, Serana, had been the last true Luna of the old royal bloodline, moonborn, meaning her blood carried an inherited resonance with the pack's oldest magic, strong enough to crown an alpha with power beyond ordinary rank. She had been murdered when Edward was 17, the night of a blood moon, in a ritual chamber she'd gone to alone. Edward had followed her. He'd seen everything, and for seeing it, someone had taken his sight, chained him, and let the pack believe the loss of his eyes was a curse, rather than a punishment for a crime he hadn't committed. "Who did it?" I asked. "I never saw his face clearly enough in the dark to be certain," Edward said. "But I know his voice. I have known it for 12 years, every time he walked past my cell to remind me what I'd lost." He didn't say the name. Not yet. "Tell me what you remember," I said. "Not the parts you've smoothed over from telling yourself the story 1,000 times. The parts that still hurt to say." He was quiet a long time before the words came. The ritual chamber smelled like burnt sage and riverstone. My mother wore silver that night, not white. Silver was for mourning, and I didn't understand yet why a Luna would dress for mourning at her own sacred rite. She told me to wait outside. I didn't listen. I heard her say one thing before the silence took her. She said, "The blood will find her anyway, and it will cost her exactly what it cost me." What did it cost her? I always believed she meant her life, Edward admitted. But now I'm no longer certain that's the whole of it. He turned his covered eyes toward me. "The moonborn bond isn't only a crown, It's a claim the old magic makes on the body that carries it. Once it wakes fully, it doesn't stay quiet again. If it isn't completed, bound to a true alpha before the same moon cycle closes, I believe it consumes the one who carries it, instead of crowning her. I think that's what happened to my mother. I think she used the little time she had left to make sure the blood would find its way to someone else before it finished the job. You're telling me that if this is real, it isn't a gift. It's a countdown. I'm telling you what I fear, Edward said, not what I know for certain. His hand found mine, steady despite the tremor I could feel just beneath his composure. But I would rather you walk into the blood moon knowing the danger and choosing it anyway than walk in believing this only makes you powerful. I thought of my sister, trembling beneath a veil that smelled like a dead queen's blood, flinching from its hem as if some part of her already understood exactly what she was avoiding. If that's true, I said slowly, then Nicole didn't steal Lawrence from me out of love. She was terrified of standing where I'm standing right now. I think you're right, Edward said. I just don't yet know who taught her to be that afraid. That was the night he told me what he could actually see, in his own way. Not shapes, not light, but a kind of map built from sound and warmth and scent. One he'd spent 12 years learning to trust, more than most people trust their eyes. He asked if he could learn my face the same way, and when I said yes, his fingers moved slowly along my jaw, my cheekbone, the place where I'd bitten my lip raw during the ceremony without noticing. He didn't say anything poetic about it. He just said quietly, "You held your whole face still for them tonight. You don't have to do that here." It was such a small thing. It undid me more than anything Roland's blade had managed. I fell asleep sitting up, my hand still in his, and for the first time since the wedding, I wasn't rehearsing an escape. I went back for the veil 3 nights later, while the hall was empty, and the pack still whispered about the bride who married a curse. I found the veil folded at the bottom of a cedar chest in Nicole's room. Along the inner hem, stitched so finely it looked decorative, ran a thread darker than the rest. Rust brown, brittle, unmistakably old blood worked into fabric by someone who wanted it hidden in plain sight. I was still holding it when the door opened behind me. It wasn't Nicole. It was Roland, a torch in one hand. "That veil belongs to the council now," he said. "Elder Alfred has asked that it be destroyed before the blood moon. Give it to me, girl, and I'll see that no one blames you for its loss." "No," I said, and stepped back, putting the cedar chest between us. When he lunged for the veil anyway, I gripped the fabric so hard that the coarse old thread bit straight into the graze the altar rail had left on my palm 3 nights earlier, a wound that had never fully closed, tender enough that the pressure alone reopened it. I felt the sting before I understood what was happening. By the time I did, it was already too late to take back. My blood was already sinking into the thread. Roland recoiled as if I'd struck him. The veil pulsed faintly, warm, and the rust-brown stitching darkened further, drinking what it was given like dry ground finally given rain. Edward had warned me 3 separate times, never to let the thread touch open blood before the blood moon confirmed the bond was safe to complete. I hadn't meant to, but I didn't let go, either, and some part of me understood, even as it happened, that I could have. "You foolish girl," Roland breathed. "You have no idea what you've woken." "Maybe not," I said, my palm throbbing. "But it's mine to wake, not yours to burn." He left without the veil. I told Edward everything when I returned to the tower, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked afraid. "I told you not to let it touch open blood," he said, his voice tight. Something in me, still raw from Roland's hands on that veil, turned the fear into anger before I could stop it. You could have told me why clearly enough that I understood the danger instead of just the warning, I snapped. You gave me half a truth wrapped in mystery, and now I'm the one paying for it. He went very still. You're right, he said after a moment. I was trying to protect you from a fear I wasn't sure was real. I should have trusted you with an unfinished truth, instead of deciding for you what you could carry. It wasn't the answer I wanted in that moment. I wanted him to simply be wrong, so my anger had somewhere clean to land. But it was the honest one, and it deflated my anger faster than any defense could have. I'm sorry, I said quietly. That wasn't fair. You didn't do this to me. Roland did. I just needed somewhere to put it. I know, Edward said. You're allowed to. Just not forever. 2 nights later, my father came to the tower alone, without guards. Leave him, Martin said quietly, not meeting my eyes even now. Renounce the marriage before the blood moon rises. Alfred says whatever you've started will fade quietly, and no one will ever have to know what almost happened here. You can come home. You can be safe. Safe, I repeated. The way Nicole is safe? Trembling every time someone mentions the veil she's terrified to wear again. My father flinched, and for once, he didn't have a ready answer. I don't want safety built out of silence, I told him. I have spent my whole life being protected from things no one would explain to me. I am done being protected that way. He left without another word. The blood moon rose 2 nights later. The entire pack gathered in the same black stone hall, where I had been rejected, this time because Edward had requested a hearing, invoking a right no chained alpha had used in 12 years. Roland presided, flanked by my father, and by Alfred, the eldest elder in Ashvale, a man so respected that no one in 3 generations had ever questioned a word he spoke. My palm had not stopped aching since the night I'd bled into the veil. By the time we entered the hall, faint silver lines had begun tracing up my forearm beneath my sleeve, delicate as frost. Chained alpha, Roland said. You have no standing to call a hearing. I have blood, Edward said, and lifted my marked hand for the hall to see, and very little time left to waste. Alfred finally spoke, and his voice carried conviction, not fear. You think I hate the throne, he said, addressing the hall more than either of us. I don't. I fear it. A moon-born Luna doesn't simply crown an alpha. She unbinds him from every check this council has spent centuries building. I watched Serana's power make her mate reckless in his final years. I swore no elder line would ever again govern a pack that could be undone by one woman's bloodline. I didn't kill Serana to steal a throne. I killed her to keep this pack from becoming a kingdom ruled by appetite instead of law. You didn't save this pack from a queen, I said. You saved yourself from ever having to answer to one. Alfred's jaw tightened, but something else moved behind his eyes this time. Not defiance. Recognition. He looked at me the way you look at a face you've spent 12 years refusing to remember, and for one unguarded second his conviction cracked open. Serana used to stand exactly where you're standing, he said, quieter now, the certainty gone thin. Her mate was my closest friend before I took her from him. I told myself for 12 years that grief made me imagine his eyes in his son's face every time I walked past that cell. I was wrong. I wasn't imagining it. I have simply refused to let myself feel it until this moment. His voice, for the first time in the hearing, shook. I do not regret keeping this pack from a queen's appetite. I will never stop regretting the boy I blinded to do it. The hall had gone utterly silent. Edward guided the silver oath blade across both our palms, mingling fresh blood with what had already sunk into the veil days before. The candles roared, torches leaping unnaturally high, and beneath the pack's gasps, I felt the countdown in my arm reverse itself. the frost lines receding as something enormous finally settled into place, rather than continuing to consume. 12 years ago, Edward said, his voice carrying through the hall. I watched a man kill the Luna of Ashvale. I could not name him then, but I have spent 12 years listening to every heartbeat that walked past my cell, and yours is the only one that always slowed when you looked at me. Alfred didn't deny it this time. He simply closed his eyes. The fight finally gone out of him. Roland began to step back from the dais, as if the hearing had never touched him. I didn't let him. 3 nights ago, I said, turning to face him instead of Alfred, this man came to my sister's chamber and asked me to hand him the very veil that just proved Alfred's guilt. He told me it needed to burn before, in his words, too many old stories start stirring. He wasn't protecting this pack from confusion. He was protecting Alfred from precisely the moment you all just witnessed. Every head in the hall turned toward Roland at once. For the first time since I'd known him, his composure didn't hold. Not into grief like Alfred's, not into confession like Nicole's, but into something smaller and uglier. The scramble of a man who has spent his whole career serving whichever power was winning. I was following the council's instruction, he said quickly. I didn't know what Alfred had done. I was only... You knew enough to bring fire instead of questions, Edward said quietly. A man following orders asks what they're for. You never once asked. Roland had no answer to that. The hall's silence this time carried none of the horror it had shown Alfred, and none of the grief it would soon show Nicole. It carried something closer to contempt, the particular withering kind reserved for men caught serving power, for its own sake, with no belief underneath it at all. Nicole stepped forward, next, the veil slipping from her hands. I knew, she said. Alfred told our mother that whichever daughter the old blood chose had to be contained. I flinched from that veil at my own wedding, because some part of me already understood it wasn't a prize. It was a leash. When the blood answered to you instead, I thought if I took your wedding, I could take your fate instead of my own. My mother spoke next, her voice thin, older than I had ever heard it. I lost a sister to this fear before either of you were born, she said. She disappeared from Ashvale the year I came of age, and no one would tell me why, only that she'd asked too many questions about the old bloodline. I swore I would never lose a daughter the same way. I see now, I nearly lost you both trying to keep that promise the wrong way. It was, in its own way, the most honest thing my mother had ever said to me. Lawrence didn't confess. He stood frozen, silent, waiting to see if the room would move past him without demanding anything. It didn't. I stepped forward and set a folded letter on the stone between us. One I'd found weeks earlier, tucked behind a loose stone in the Training Bluff's old sparring shed, sealed with Alfred's mark, promising Lawrence a council seat in exchange for a public rejection before the wedding. I had carried it since, not understanding what it meant until tonight. You don't have to say it, I told him, my voice steadier than I expected. The letter already has. Lawrence stared at the paper like it might vanish if he looked away. I almost tore that letter apart the day I received it, he said finally, quiet enough that only the front rows heard. I told myself for 3 days I would refuse Alfred and marry you exactly as I'd promised. I chose the seat on the 4th day. I don't have a better excuse than that I wanted it more than I wanted to keep my word. He knelt. I looked down at the man who had once been my whole future. The old ache from the training bluff rose in my chest one last time, sharp and real, before I let it go. No, I said. You made a choice. I'm simply the one who finally gets to make mine. They led Alfred out through the same corridor that led to the western tower, and I made myself walk beside him for the first few steps, rather than simply watch him go. At the threshold of the cell that had been Edward's for 12 years. He paused and said, without turning, "Tell him I heard what she said. At the end. About the blood finding you anyway. I heard it, and I still chose not to listen." He stepped inside before I could answer, and the same iron door that had once locked Edward away closed behind him instead. Roland was stripped of his council seat before the hall even fully emptied, not exiled, not imprisoned, but worse in Ashvale's eyes, reassigned to oversee the pack's grain stores, a post given to elders too compromised to be trusted with anything that mattered. I watched the pack's younger wolves whisper his name for weeks afterward, not with fear anymore, but with the particular scorn reserved for a man everyone had once been afraid of, and now merely found small. Lawrence reported to the border patrol post 3 mornings later. I wasn't there to see it, but Edward was, and he told me afterward that the first order Lawrence received came from a wolf who had saluted him as his commander only a season before, and that Lawrence saluted back, without hesitation, without complaint, like a man who understood exactly what he owed and had finally stopped arguing about the price. Nicole asked, quietly, whether I could ever forgive her. "Not yet," I said. "Maybe not for a long time." I held the burned edge of the veil's thread between my fingers, the last of the old blood finally spent. But I don't hate you anymore, and a season ago I would have. That has to count for something, even before it's ready to be called forgiveness. She accepted exile from the valley for a season, not as punishment, but as the only honest space either of us had left. I turned to Edward, whose eyes, pale silver, unmarked, simply unseeing in ordinary light, found mine with an ease that had nothing to do with sight and everything to do with the bond humming steady and certain between us. "And so did I said. Ashvale crowned us 7 nights later, under an ordinary moon this time. No blood in the sky, no blade at my throat, no countdown climbing silently up my arm. I think about that wedding hall often. The version of me who nearly lost her footing in front of 300 wolves, and somehow, barely, didn't. I understand now that it wasn't rejection at all. It was the first moment anyone in that pack ever treated my power as something to be feared rather than something to be quietly buried. And I understand something else now, too, that being contained and being protected are not the same thing, no matter how many people insist on confusing the two. Alfred least of all, and maybe not even my own mother in the end. Edward likes to say he saw me before anyone else did, and he means it literally and otherwise. I believe him. I've learned that the people who truly see you rarely need their eyes to do it, and that the ones who fear what you might become were never protecting you at all. They were. If you've ever been told your strength was too dangerous to be trusted, remember this. The ones who try hardest to contain you are usually the ones who already know exactly what you're capable of. If this story found you at the right moment, join the Storyverse, follow along, and let the next one find you too.